you see him then get converted at Ivy while he's at Bucknell, and then he goes to, he's at Westminster or
Gordon
no?
Conwell.
Gordon Conwell is next. That's right, because he goes to
Mm-hmm.
Westminster later, and then to Hopewell. What? Not just about him. What's amazing to me is the book is not just really about him. It's about Kathy almost as much as it is about him.
Right.
And what I was amazed about her, the fact that she was corresponding with C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
I mean, she was like an 11-year-old kid.
Yeah, 11, 12. And then he died when she was 13. She was one of the last people that he wrote.
Which is absolutely incredible to me. I thought that was pretty interesting. But talk about how Kathy has shaped his life. They have really done ministry together, and sometimes she's in his shadow. But as you mentioned in the book, she is, you really don't have Tim without Kathy in so many different ways.
Not at all. So you mentioned John Guest earlier, and one of the things that stood out to me about John Guest was saying Kathy Christie is one of the is the greatest youth organizer in Western Pennsylvania. Well, I mean, first of all, how often do you have an older church leader identify a teenage girl for what she's doing there? Mm-hmm. Second, Western Pennsylvania was caught up in a pretty substantial evangelical awakening during that time. And I situate that within the teaching of John Gerstner, and especially his focus on Jonathan Edwards, as well as, of course, more famously, R.C. Sproul and the Ligonier Valley Study Center in Stallstown, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. And so to say that Kathy was the greatest youth organizer in Western Pennsylvania is to say at this time of revival that was spreading throughout Pittsburgh, which was this absolute Presbyterian powerhouse, she was the most outstanding Young Life student. Young Life was just this huge movement, especially at the time. And so that's Kathy before she ever meets Tim. And it's not a surprise that in Tim's first major, what would become best-selling book, The Reason for God, he dedicates it, if I'm not mistaken, to Kathy the Valiant. And then from there also goes through and says, hey, yeah, my biggest influences are Edwards and Lewis, but I mean, I got to them from Kathy. Kathy's the one who told me as an undergraduate to read the Chronicles of Narnia. Because she had been a correspondent with the author of these books. She's the one who talked to me about Reformed theology and about Jonathan Edwards, and she's the one who steered me in these directions. And so, and I think that's true not just in an intellectual sense and ultimately a spiritual sense, but in a personal sense. They are, I don't know that I would say that they're a paradigm for ministry marriages, but they are uncommon in how close they are at every level, whether it's book writing. Kathy worked professionally in Philadelphia as a book editor, whether it's book writing or whether it's sermons or whether it's Q&A sessions or whether it's just, they've just been partners, emotionally knit together. They spent a lot of time with each other in that apartment on Roosevelt Island. And yeah, like I said, I don't think it's necessarily a model because I don't think ministry marriages are supposed to look the same necessarily. But it's certainly noteworthy from a historical perspective.
Well, then you go from Gordon Conwell, which had so many different professors that you mentioned in there, Richard Lovelace, Edmund Clowney. I mean, these are people that have had huge influence on his life. And I was actually struck by when you mentioned, and it was funny because you call her Betsy Elliott. I mean, of course, most people know her as Elizabeth Elliott. Right. And you said she was really tall. How tall was she? I was trying to look that up.
Yeah, I don't think I actually can recall that. I mean, there's tall, and then there's also posture. And I think it's safe to say Elizabeth Elliott would have carried herself in a pretty strict posture.
Well, even when you mentioned about her talking about how he really developed his position on understanding women and gender, and you cite her walking around the classroom. This is Elizabeth Elliott saying, I'm smarter than most of you in this class. I've gone through more suffering than you in this class. I was reading this like, oh my.
Well, you got to remember the first introduction they get to her is not as Elizabeth Elliott. They get to know her as Elizabeth Leach, the wife of Professor Addison Leach. and Tim is taking, that's why she's at Gordon Conwell. And so Tim and Kathy, well, Tim is taking Addison Leach's class when Addison Leach finds out that he's got his terminal cancer has returned and he's going to die. And then they go to the memorial service, and it's the memorial service that Elizabeth Leach starts, according to my sources, yelling at the students for not seeing their professors as people who need our sympathy and prayer and support, but instead these sort of distant figures. And the response I got was, we had no idea who she was. We just thought she was this demure professor's wife, but nope, it wasn't her.
Wow.
Sounded like she was quite the you loved her or you hated her. There doesn't sound like there was a lot in between, but the Kellers definitely loved her.